It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today in conversation with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton in her office in the Rayburn building. Since 1990, Eleanor Holmes Norton has served in the U.S. House as congressional delegate representing the District of Columbia, where she has lived for most of her life. Indeed, the district is a central part of her mission in Congress, where she has been championing a long struggle to achieve full representation for the people of Washington, D.C. One might say that Eleanor Holmes Norton's entire career could be described as inspired by a passion for rights, human rights, civil rights, employment rights, welfare rights, women's rights, voting rights, a long list. She has been a recognized leader in all of these great struggles to make ours a better society. I'd like to begin our conversation by thanking you for agreeing to have it and for having us here, and asking you to reflect or comment on this way of framing your public career. In looking back, is this a way that you might, so to speak, describe your story?
It's an interesting way as I listen to you. When you consider my life as a native Washingtonian, born the first of three girls, into the segregated nation's capital, going to segregated schools where everything was segregated except the library and the buses, where at an early age one learned to fight for one's rights, where there was no mayor and no city council and no civil rights. And when I consider that when I went off to school and then to law school, that I went to the South as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to fight for rights, and that going to law school was really about the fact that there were few black lawyers prepared to practice civil rights. And then you think of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, which was about everybody's human rights, and that big, glorious, multifaceted, multicultural city as it has always been. The rest of America only became multicultural recently. And that was the New York City Commission on Human Rights and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission rights. And lo and behold, to become to be the member of Congress from my hometown, which has fewer rights than any jurisdiction in the United States. I think you maybe have that right about rights. It means I've been struggling for rights.
I'll let you use it as a title for your biography.
I'll try to remember that.
You know, when I hear you say that, though, of course, I realize that when one talks about a passion for rights and lists all of those grand causes, it's not about an abstract list of causes you've attached yourself to. It's about the personal is political. It's about your life.
Well, it is, but you know, I think it's real important that to be able to generalize from one's own personal experience. Having, what astounds me, frankly, are the instances where people have themselves experienced some form of prejudice and don't see how that principle would apply elsewhere. I think early grounding in the principle was experiencing it. And of course in Washington, where there was a large educated black middle class, we really thought people who were prejudiced were ignorant. I kind of learned that, you know, white folks that kept us from going to school should feel sorry for them. I didn't learn, I never learned to hate them. We really did think that educated people would never discriminate against anyone. And that they really were to be pitied, and that in the real sense we were far better off that we didn't have these kinds of problems, because it would imply certain other kinds of things about us.
You know, picking up from just that comment, can you talk to us a little bit about those influential people in your life early on who framed your thinking that way, who made you say, there's something wrong with this person, they should think that way? How did you get the strength and the encouragement and the conviction?
Well, you begin with parents in the African American community who had struggled for education, and essentially, and here's where growing up in the District of Columbia may be somewhat different. Remember, this is the home of the flagship of the educational flagship of Black America, Howard University, where there was always a strong, educated group of Black people. So you grow up with people who make you think about rights very early in a community which was very sophisticated about rights. I mean, I remember when I was a little girl seeing Mary Church Terrell picket Hecht's department store, because you could go into Hecht's department store, you could try on clothes in Hecht's department store, but you could use the bathroom in Hecht's department store. And that's getting a very early education when you're a little girl, see a grand dame, a Black woman who was a leader of the community, fling herself around a picket line. It's not hard for you to see that's what you ought to do too. I think growing up in a city of very conscious people, conscious about human rights, conscious about education, and in a family where, remember, I was born just before World War II, in a family where the New Deal was second nature, where people talked about what it meant. All of that, I think, helped me to fasten on the notion that when rights were denied, something was wrong, and maybe you ought to see what you can do about it.
At what stage in your career did you decide that you wanted to go to law school? And how did that happen? You went to Antioch, and then you went to Yale and took both an MA and a law degree, which is incredible.
Well, when I went to Antioch, I wasn't sure what I wanted to be. I grew up wanting to be a journalist, wanting to write, I think. Then I thought, well, maybe I want to be a doctor or a scientist. When I got to Antioch, which was a transforming experience in my life, it was very important to go away to a school that put a very high value on the life of the mind and on contrariness in politics. Where, you know, the McCarthy period had seized, it was the late 50s, had seized the country, and there were a few places in the country which stood against that. All of that was very important. But it didn't take long for me to recognize at Antioch that I wanted to become a lawyer, because the civil rights movement was just building up. The Montgomery bus boycott had come in 1957, and you were finally, remember, the schools were integrated in the District of Columbia. Only 54 decision came that only in 55 or 56. So the consciousness that came from growing up in a town that was segregated, where rights were denied, was easily, for me, transferred into, well, what can you do about it? What do you do if you're going to go to college? And to be a lawyer seemed to me to be precisely what to do. I went to law school only because I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, a civil abuse lawyer. And I must say, I'm one of those people for whom you say, watch what you wish for. It did come true.
What did you major in at Antioch?
History.
You majored in history and then went on to get the master's in history. And isn't Antioch a school in which people, you do work and study?
And that was work and study.
What did you do?
I went all over the country doing all kinds of things. That was another reason why I went to Antioch. But going to law school was a very strange thing for an Antiochian to do at that time, because Antioch was mostly known for producing PhDs. And one of the reasons I have a master's degree in American Studies, a degree I never intended to use, is that though I wanted to be a lawyer in order to practice civil rights law, I really regarded it as a trade school where one was not really developing the life of the mind, but was preparing for a profession. Yes. And C. Van Woodward and Professor Blum were in the history department at Yale. That's one of the reasons I went to Yale, that you could pursue a master's and a law degree at the same time and not give yourself over entirely to a vocational school.
How many Black students were at Antioch at the time that you went out of the student body?
Well, when I went to college, what was it, 1955,
Yeah.
there were few black students anywhere in the United States except at my own native Washington Howard University.
Mhm.
And black people were basically educated in black institutions. I was able to go not only because of scholarships from Antioch, but because of something called the National Scholarship Service and Fund for Negro Students. The Ford Foundation undertook to try to encourage the colleges to be integrated with black schools. So that what they would do if you were accepted in a basically white institution would be to add money to what that institution had given. And there are virtually all of us, I think, I shouldn't say that, I don't know about most people, but I do know that that was important.
Mm-hmm.
That supplementary scholarship was important, but it was a way of beginning, frankly, what became a reality only after the death of Martin Luther King. There were token numbers of blacks in major white institutions up to all through the time I was in law school. And after the King assassination, then people began to look closely at how they were educating Americans, and we began to see many more African Americans coming to white institutions. But there were token, even Antioch, as progressive as it was, there were token numbers of blacks there and in every institution, white institution in the United States.
What did it feel like?
Well,
I mean, first of all, it was, from my perspective, a very gutsy thing to do.
Well,
And
when
what
the
did it feel
students
like?
went after when the students went after Martin Luther King assassination, there was this sense of alienation that they felt. For students that went earlier,
In the
expecting
50s.
that there would be very few black
Yeah.
students, there was no such thing. I mean, we went prepared, knowing that there would be few of us, and if that was going to make you feel lonely, you better stay at home or go someplace else. I mean, you went knowing that that America was not an integrated society, wasn't even close to being an integrated society. We had the statute. It was my great honor to administer the Equal Employment Opportunity, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That wasn't even in anybody's mind.
Right.
None of these statutes had been enacted, so you went, and the kind of student that went was the kind of student that was looking for that adventure, prepared for it, and prepared to deal with it. The problem with that is that everybody ought to be able to go to school and get into school.
Yes.
And the country was not ready for that. It was only ready for those who were ready for those schools. Ready psychologically for those schools, it goes without saying academically, but ready psychologically for those schools.
Was there anyone throughout this period or earlier that you would single out as sustaining you in making these choices and going out there? Clearly you had a supportive family. Your parents, or were there friends in these environments that you were able to talk to and get encouragement from? Or
There were always friends in these environments that you found. I remember a woman named Jessie Treichler at Antioch who was much admired. Pauli Murray, who is a black woman who became a priest and was getting a PhD at Yale when I was there, who seemed very strange at the time because she was such an early feminist, was somebody that we looked to and listened to.
Outspoken.
But I really think what was central to my own life is really an accident of history, and that is I'm the oldest girl. That is this, and the oldest girl, and when I was born, and in the kind of family that I was born, essentially took on certain kinds of responsibilities and became very, very independent. Now, my mother and father had a fairly modern notion of what an oldest child was supposed to be like. I am not 3 years older than the youngest, by the way. So when I say I'm the oldest girl, it doesn't mean I have a kid sister somewhere. But my grandmother, an aunt whose back faced our back, had an old-fashioned sense of what the oldest child was supposed to do. Now, Portia and Nellie, the second and third child, didn't exactly consider, I was the one who was supposed to tell them what to do, but there was a sense of greater responsibility and a sense that really older children, the eldest children have just from being the eldest. they are alone in the world for a while, and as you know from all the literature, they often are able to do things in the society that people assign only to the fact that they were born first. So I don't like to take a lot of credit for anything that's happened to me. Although I must say my second sister, who I'm 13 months older than, is president of Albany State University. She's a leader and a college president, so I'm not sure that this really holds up.
Where did they go to college? Did they follow you to Antioch?
No, they went to school right here in the District of Columbia, to Howard and to Minor Teachers College, which is now DC University District of Columbia.
Yeah.
But the one who is president of Albany State University, Portia Holmes Shields, went to the local Teachers College, then called Minor Teachers College. It was Minor Teachers College, Howard University were very central to the production of a well-educated black middle class in a segregated city.
You, what I was trying to find out about, because I'm just remembering back, I was in college at about that time, and I was at a public institution, Brooklyn College. It cost $7 a semester, so there were a few more of us who couldn't afford much more than that who were there of all kinds, but nonetheless, I don't think I even noticed at the time the question about what proportion of Negro, black students, called in those days, students were there, but it was certainly very tiny. And so I'm just picturing you going away to school and being just, such a small minority, and what that must have felt like. And
I should say that a lot had to do with Dunbar High School. Dunbar High School was, for many years, famous college preparatory public high school. You didn't have to take a test to get in. You it was for a long time the only college preparatory high school. Then another one came along maybe about 10 or 15 years before integration, Spingarn High School, but it had many notable blacks came from the school. Well, the school became so well known for its education and the value it put on education, despite the fact that it was an ordinary public high school, that colleges from all over the country came to recruit here. So in going away to school, you have to understand, they came looking for us. And people went to all the Ivy League schools all across the United States, because they wanted to have some black students, and this black school was known for turning out good
wonderful students.
So when you went to school, you knew you wanted to go to law school. You in fact did that. You became a lawyer. And the first time that you became a name in my life was a little bit later than that, but not all that much later. It was in 1971 when the Center for American Women and Politics was established, and you were one of the members of the founding advisory committee. And
Sure was.
Yep, and at that time you were in New York City with the Human Rights Commission, and already someone who was known as a leader and someone who was known as, in a sense, a feminist, though we weren't using the language quite that way by 1971, but the issue of women had already come to the forefront. And
importantly, yes.
Yeah. Tell me when that issue and your life intersected with one another. We know that the race issue certainly was there from early childhood, but the women's issue didn't come on the public agenda until the late 60s, but you were there right from the beginning.
Right from the beginning, again, this notion of generalizing from your own personal experience. It seemed to me clear, having experienced discrimination, that the carryover principle was as clear as the nose on your face. But in my own community, my own African American community, there was great confusion, is really the right word for it. Great confusion. Here we were, finally, after hundreds of years, with the attention of our country having just gotten the civil rights bills passed, and along came white women talking about rights. A lot of confusion. Didn't white women have rights? Did they want some of the same rights we wanted? Well, I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to think through and to help to the extent that I had a podium, people in my own community think through what it is we had in common, not only with women, but with other people who, as I believe the women's movement was doing, used our movement as a way to actualize and understand their own denials. I thought that was wonderful, not anything to be decried, and we had to understand it was a great tribute to our movement that women, many white women, because that's who they were talking about, who had supported our movement, had come to understand its relevance to their own subservient condition, even as my favorite analogy, the first abolitionists were white women. It took them a long time to say, hey, wait a minute, we too do not have the right to vote. But they understood initially the most obvious oppression, the oppression of the slave, and the first people to step forward were white women. Well, white women, after the civil rights movement had crested after Martin Luther King's death, after people truly read the literature that was beginning to come forward, finally got it. They finally got it. And there were, I must say, very few black women who stepped forward at that point because they didn't, not I think because they didn't want to, but because the confusion was so rampant in our community. Well, I thought it was important for somebody in our community to explain it. And to the extent that I had that opportunity, particularly as New York City Commissioner on Human Rights, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity. I remember when I became New York City Commissioner of Human Rights, steeped in the struggle, going around to women's groups in New York saying, where in the world are you? The only people who file complaints are black people. Don't you understand? And here are the reasons that there's no, if you go into a hospital to have a baby, you will pay for most of that. But if you go into a hospital to have almost anything else, you will not. Can you get a job anywhere downtown? Black people know what to do when they can't get a job downtown. Let me tell you what you want to do. Well, I mean, I literally went to the women's organizations to stir up complaints. So few complaints from women had I found when I got there. Black people, the black men who served in this institution I now served, the House of Representatives deserve credit for always understanding how to vote on women's issues. The vote was there. There were too few black women who had any visible position to speak to other women. One was Shirley Chisholm, who never doubted that she was both black and a woman. And her spokesmanship was important. And when I became Human Rights Commission, I believed that it was my obligation to try to think these things through and to try to help black women to think them through. The differences between black and white women were perfectly plain, but so were the similarities. And to the extent that being New York City Commissioner of Human Rights helped me to have a pulpit from which to talk about those similarities, or better still, to demonstrate them by, in fact, receiving complaints and issuing complaints, because there were commission-initiated complaints. Then the work that I had been about from the time I was a child, I say it's the work because it was always the work of somebody who was black, simply took another form, or an additional form, because the work for civil rights for black people remained right there. It's just that life is more complicated than that. Once you make the point that human rights is universal, you have made that point for everybody. Sit down. Expect everybody else to step up and say amen. And then you help them to say amen. You strengthen your movement, and you make the principle indelible and more widespread for yourself and for others.
Congresswoman Norton, I'm reminded by what you're saying so eloquently at this point of a time that you came to the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers back in the 80s. And one of the students asked you a question about these two issues of race and gender, which was, these are both problems that people have looked at as intractable. How can we get through them? How can we make things better? And in your view, which one is the more intractable issue, race or gender? And you sort of looked into the middle distance and you said, well, you know, if we put our minds to it, we could handle the race one in about 25 years. Gender, now that one's going to take a little longer. Where are you now on that issue?
Well, we,
15 years later.
15 years later, we, time brings not only changes but new problems, and there are new problems of race in our society. Many of the problems for which racism became best known are not there any longer.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that were cemented and reinforced by law. What women have been able to do has occurred more quickly than I imagined, in part because the civil rights movement had skidded the way so that we no longer have a statute that says race, it has to always say gender. And in part because there is such a huge number of people we're talking about, half the society. Nevertheless, the issues around women's status are part and parcel of every society in the world, which whether that is a black society or a white society, whatever the race, which builds in the notion that there are the first people and there are the second people.
Mm-hmm.
And women are the second people. We are the second people here. We're the second people in Afghanistan. We are the second people throughout the world. So I still say that racism is a kind of perversion that once it is shown for what it is, you can fight back.
Mm-hmm.
We have learned that that fight may be long and we are still fighting it, but you can fight back because it is understood to be a perversion.
Mm-hmm.
Because it applies to men and women, it's easier to understand it to be a perversion. But practices that seem to me to be absolutely perverse, like genital mutilation, are accepted and shrouded in tradition, and sometimes even religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that gender is more ingrained and more accepted when it is traditional, whether it is traditional mode or it is perverse.
Mm-hmm.
And to that extent, I suppose that still stands, even though racism is still a indelible part of the society with which we are still struggling.
In our nation, and it does seem at this moment that we'll talk about that, I hope, a little while, because you refer to the women in Afghanistan, and it's just such a stark image of what the range of experiences are for women. If we sit here in the office of a congresswoman in the United States of America and we think about the women in Afghanistan at this moment who are covered completely and living in a state that we can not even imagine. So the range is extraordinary. And we didn't start from there. In the early 70s, when you and I first met and when the women's movement, the women's political movement began, we weren't starting from that point. We were in bad shape, but we were starting from a better point. What do you think when you look at what's happened for women in politics in these 30 years, something that you've been involved in every day of your life and something that I've had the privilege of looking at and kind of cheering on? What do you think the real progress has been? And I'm assuming that you agree with me that there's been real progress in numbers and status, breakthroughs. How would you describe it, and what do you think we're facing, and how tough is it in the Congress?
Well, the progress even at the time that I've been in Congress, we doubled the number of women.
Mm-hmm.
The progress is clear.
Quantitatively.
Quantitatively, but even quantitatively, I demur. As clear as it is that a girl in the 7th grade today is living in a different world from when I was in the 7th grade at Banneker Junior High School, in terms of her possibilities and the ease with which she can recognize them. I do not set for myself the standard of where we have been and how far we have come. I believe that is too low a standard. Therefore, while I applaud the fact that we have, 50-some women in the Congress today, and know that it is easier even than it was just a few years ago when I came to Congress in 1994 for a woman to run and to run straight away. Still, when I look at 440 members, is 50-some almost 60? I forget the number. Anything to write home about? I'm not going to start writing home about it yet. 13 senators. It's been painstaking, a few each year. Now, why do I think that is nothing to write home about, as proud as I am of the progress? Because I think women have real power that they simply have not used. Part of the reason is that the issues are so multiple that once we left the first period of feminism in the late 60s and early 70s, where it was pretty clear that employment, abortion, let's face it, there were no more than 3 or 4 issues where everybody had to concentrate on. Then the issues proliferated, as well they might, because the group is so massive. And since they're proliferated, they're all over the map. Thus, it is more difficult to feel women's power, because women have had to disperse that power across many issues.
And Ruth and I are teaching a seminar, a leadership scholars seminar at Rutgers, and one of the things that we're noticing, just this multiple choice that they have, that there's a kind of paralysis that sets in, even among those who consciously want to go out there and lead. They're feeling, how in the world do I decide what to do and where to tackle this? And I think that that's one of the critical issues with this generation. The issues are somehow blurred, less clear than they were a generation ago. And that means that the young women are having a harder time focusing on what they need to do next.
Well, there are huge issues on the table that I couldn't agree with you more, that, when you try to figure out which, you can always find an issue in which you can be really useful and make progress on. There's no question that progress has been enormous on many, if not most, of these issues. But if I were to say to you, all right, women, choose an issue that among the many out there, and tell me what it is that we should strive for within the next 3 or 4 years. Well, you'd have a cacophony of voices, because it would be hard to choose one. I find, our cup runneth over. In a real sense, we've got all of this energy, but I have to tell you, men in the Congress can get away with giving lip service to it. And everybody will stand up for equal pay and for childcare, and you don't see anything happening on either of those mammoth issues. The one that strikes me, as somebody whose children are grown now and doesn't have to perhaps worry about it anymore, but really strikes me as central, is the notion of being a civilized nation which does not provide childcare while sending its women off to work willy-nilly. I think women could correct that within a couple of 3 years if somehow you brought all that power together on that issue. People are afraid of women up here. If women ever get on their case, you will see people, regardless of party, respond there's no vote more powerful than the, quote, women's vote.
But you as representatives need a lot more evidence that there are groups massing out there around these specific issues before you can carry that kind of thing.
It really is. It doesn't matter that we're for them.
Mhm.
It matters that there's a woman's vote out there that says, hey, this is it.
Mhm.
And now, because women are all over the map, the only thing you can't get a consensus on is abortion or very controversial issues. But when it comes, you will get every member of the House saying they're for child care. And you have seen nothing significant happen, at least in a universal sense on child care, ever. We have some tax credits. We certainly help low-income women. But the average woman who graduates from high school, much less college today, looks at herself as a worker.
Mhm.
The story of what she does in the first years of life, of the lives of her children, is a horrific story.
Mhm.
And because these are women whose traditions say you do what you have to do in the home, these matters are simply dealt with as best people can. I think the problem is that as best people can, when people are increasingly going to work more and more hours, is not good enough for children.
Mhm.
So that I think that the men in the Congress are getting away with murder because we all have learned that there is a huge women's vote, that they are very attentive to issues, and that we ought to always tell them that we're for their issues.
Mhm.
We know that there will be a few that will divide the House, but that's all right if we're all for these others, like child care and equal pay. Not to worry, nobody expects you to come up with something very specific, but they do want you to hear, they do want to hear about those when you come around and talk to them. Then people will know that you care, and that will be enough. But I tell you one thing, the guys who come to see me in alligator shoes, to lobby me on business issues, don't just want to know that I care. They have some language and some bills. They wonder if I will go on a bill and sponsor it. And they have a time frame by which this must be done.
Why do you think you talk about the huge reservoir of power, and I couldn't agree with you more, and it can be very frustrating to know that we have it and to see what we don't move. On that issue, on the child care issue, which strikes me as so difficult to assume that women are going to come together and recognize a power to move, because there is such a traditional, long-standing, deep-seated set of conflicting thoughts, emotions, history about their roles as mothers and going out to work and so forth, that it's hard to picture a vision that would work for them. Are you thinking of women coming and putting their power behind public child care, subsidized child care, some kind of bouquet?
Well, I think that the issue is easily resolved. For example, I have the greatest respect for women who did what I did not do. I went to work when both of my children were a month old, because I had a mother-in-law. I could afford additional help, so I get no credit. It was easy for me to do. I don't know how the average woman does it, and the average woman goes to school well before her children are in kindergarten or in primary school. So I think that a woman who decides that she wants to take time out deserves help from the United States Congress, but I don't see these things as competing visions. I think that with the combination of child credits for people who wanted to stay at home, and I wouldn't even call it subsidized child care. Some of it would have, we'd have that now. I think every child should be able to go to school at 3 years old. I think what we know about brain science tells us that if a child can go, those who want to, this should not be required, that if a child gets access to education that early, a child almost always learns to read. Try teaching somebody who didn't learn to read when she's 8 years old. But if you get the person when they're ready to read and getting ready to read, I think that there should be a vision large enough to capture the diverse ways to be parents in this society. I would even encourage people, young people, to stay at home if that was the best thing for them and their children. I would encourage that. I think it's very hard to find somebody to leave your infant with that you can have confidence will raise that infant as this is not a nanny society for the most part. On the other hand, it does seem to me that they have child care only for poor or near poor people. It's like saying, we will pay for public education for poor or near poor people. Well, that's anathema to American democracy, and it's why all of us are who we are, is that with public education out there. But there was always the right to send your own child to a private school. In the same way, it seems to me, given what we now know about brain development and what we know about the harm of simply leaving a child catch as catch can, perhaps in a place where there are not people whose background is child development, but maybe people who are poorly paid. Given all we know about that, it seems to me we ought to bring those competing visions together in one big bill that would in fact accommodate parents and children in our society instead of all the lip service that are given women.
Yes.
To make them believe that they're all with them and for them.
And when we see this issue running across the board, where even the most privileged women in corporate settings who are making their way up make a decision about whether they're going to have children or not, about 2/3 of top-ranking management women, I saw in a recent survey that Catalyst did, have children. And they spend a fair proportion of their high salaries on live-in nannies, whereas their counterpart males, over 90% of them have children. So they're making active choices not to have children, or if they have children, to spend huge hunks of their salary for childcare. So it's across the board, there's a need. It's hidden in the upper levels, but it's certainly there.
Well, we don't make public education available on the basis of income. We shouldn't make educational child care available on the basis of income. For moderate income women, we're doing nothing. For middle class women, we're doing absolutely nothing.
Right.
They leave their children with this or that neighbor. They leave their children in this or their child care place with often poorly paid people. And that's what you're doing for the generation of children that are being raised today and getting away with it. I think women ought to be screaming to high heaven.
What about the women in Congress taking leadership on
Well,
this?
the women in Congress have, and it doesn't matter. Nothing happens here. This is a real democracy, I have to tell you. That's one thing I've learned. That when I really want something done, I don't just do dear colleagues. I make sure that the people who members listen to have heard from them. Why should they do it for me? I don't vote for them. The people who do vote for them are who decide these issues. Women have enormous power. And of course, this power has been felt. And in fact, we've been able to get pregnancy discrimination bills. We're able to get domestic violence. There's no question that women have done very well by their power. But when I get to the harder issues of women's power, and ones that cost money, for example, the domestic violence bill doesn't cost a lot of money. Pregnancy discrimination costs money mostly for private business. This would be money that localities and the federal government would have to pay. When we get to that, women have the power to break through that. But to do so, they'd have to organize themselves differently. It's not that women have not pressed for this. Women have desperately pressed for this. But it would have to become a national goal, cutting across the women's movement, the women who want to stay at home, joining with the women who want to go to work. You'd see something happen in this place.
Can I ask one last question on the women in politics part? And that is, you said the numbers are not very impressive when you look at the numbers in Congress, and I agree. It's been a long time, 30 years, and about 13%, both House and Senate. If you had to say, what do you think the major reasons are? Are enough women out there in the country aware of their potential power as leaders in government and politics?
Part of it has to do with the pipeline that people tend to get to national office by rising through the ranks, and therefore this is coming faster now because the pipeline has moved women up. Part of it is the cost of running for office. I don't think that women in many parts of the country bring a natural disadvantage that they once did when they run for Congress. Parts of the country, to be sure they do, but I don't think it's the natural disadvantage it was. Some people would say in some parts of the country it's an advantage. We find that sometimes the other party will put up a woman against our man because our man is to try to break through. So that works both ways. It may be that in a country as complicated as this, you cannot make huge leaps forward. But you've got to keep on your mind, and you've got to set goals for yourself, or else the numbers will come in just that, 3s and 4s and 1s and 2s. The kind of leap forward that black people had in 1992, I guess it was, you're not going to see again. We increased the black caucus by 50%. And the reason we had this huge increase, it had nothing to do with all of a sudden blacks had become more conscious. It really had to do with the voting rights amendment, and for the first time we got Southern members. Well, you see, women don't have that kind of breakthrough out there. So they're going to have to do it the hard way, the old-fashioned way.
One seat at a time.
One seat at a time.
Well, I'd like to back off a bit from the particular discussion of women in leadership and talk about your perceptions over the years of the quality of leadership. In different areas, you've had experience in the civil rights movement, now you're in the House, you've done a variety of things out there in the world. You've observed a lot of leadership over these years, I suppose good, bad, indifferent. Do you have a sense of the evolution of the quality of leadership in the years that you've been in public life? Do you have a sense of the kinds of leadership that will work for us in the future and what has worked in the past?
For women?
For everybody. In a way, what I'm asking is, particularly, I'm remembering at one point in the 80s, you gave a presentation at the Ford Foundation, I believe, and you were talking about how we are slowly arriving at a time in which gender is really less of a determining factor in our lives. And I agree with you. I think that this is true. Slow but true, as we've all been saying. But then the question that emerges is, what about all the other changes that have been happening in the past 30, 40 years? Are we really wanting to call on a new kind of leadership, or are we just wanting to call on a better kind of old leadership? That is the quality of the leaders that you've observed over the years in your own career, has it been improving? Has it been getting less good than it used to be? Where do you come down on that one?
Well, leadership has proliferated. We've left the kind of leadership, certainly women, blacks, Hispanics have left the kind of leadership we were used to, where there were a few identifiable leaders.
Yes.
And we ought to be very grateful for that, because it tells us that we are making progress.
You mean the old big boss kind of leadership?
Yeah, you know who the leaders are. The leaders are for women, you know who the leaders are for blacks, and you know who they are for Hispanics. Well, today I would say, who are they? Tell me.
Yes.
Give me that answer, please.
But you're saying that's not so bad.
I'm saying that is good.
Yes.
I'm saying the more perches from which leadership can be exercised, the better off the group is. The poor leadership of let's take the period after the vote in 1920 and go up to 1960, where you had so few leaders who were blacks or who were women. Geez, that was a big burden to carry, wasn't it? The white man's burden on your back. To carry these issues by yourself, because women because so few leaders were allowed. So you had to carry them all, so that meant that meant, frankly, because you had so few leaders, that you couldn't make progress very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the black community, our leaders were almost certainly the civil rights leaders. There were a few members of Congress, but the national leaders were the civil rights leaders, and everybody knew their name. Well, now we have, I don't know, 39 or so black members, and most people don't know their names, but it's a more important leadership.
Yes.
It's a more important leadership. For women, that is truly the case. One would have expected to see more women who are national leaders than we have today, however. And the fact that you can name so few women whose names are second nature to the country, given the fact that women are better educated than men today, and half the population does speak to women being way behind in leadership if one looks at numerical leadership for the definition of leadership. But if one gets below the surface and looks at the number of women in Congress, the number of women who are mayors, who are on their school boards, who are members of their councils, who run things in their community, then of course one has seen leadership redefined in our times.
I don't want, I'm thinking of a whole lot of other questions, and I know our time is limited about women in politics, but there is then the larger world, and in the limited time that we have. It is such a moment. We're talking here 1 month after September 11th, which seems to me to be a watershed moment in our history and in the history of the world. I don't know what it means, where it's going. I'm personally pretty scared. You're in a leadership position. I just wanted to get an opportunity to hear from your perch what you think we should be considering now in terms of leadership. And I don't know how much of it one can talk about with regard to women, gender, or race at this moment.
Well, I think it's a test of the American character. I really do. If this can take a people who conquered the frontier, who became leaders of the world, who saved the world from fascism, if we can be thrown off balance for a long period of time by this, then of course the American character isn't what I think it is. We are going to go through a period of readjustments. We are people who lived on the boundaries of oceans and continents. Nobody could get to us. We went to where others were in trouble. So it calls for a total readjustment to understand that fanatics can get to you, and that you are being called upon to do two things at the same time: be careful and be normal. And let's see if Americans can walk and chew gum at the same time. I kind of think they can. But it is a new experience in American life. One of the reasons I think we can, after a period of readjustment, after we get through, all right, it's shaking, it's like an earthquake, it's shaking, okay, it's stopped now. Now I know what to do the next time it shakes. After we get through that period, and one of the things that helps me to get through the period is to think of Western societies that have lived with terrorism. Once I know there are such societies, that's it. Anything they can do, I can do better. I'm an American.
I love your optimism about all of this. Do you think, one of the students in our class reported to us after a week, the class meets on Tuesdays and we had to cancel it because the whole event was going on at the time that the class was to start, so we met again a week later. And she said, where were the women? This is supposed to be a class on women's leadership. Last week we were talking about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Here it is, 80 years after women got the vote, and throughout all of this, women have seemed invisible to me. Well, we've started to see more women. We saw Barbara Lee voting against the credits for the president and being surprised that she was the only one who'd done so. But I think it is a wake-up call for those of us who are trying to raise consciousness about these issues and are aware of what our students are seeing and how they're reacting to all of this. Do you think there will be any impetus at all as a result of all of this for more involvement of groups in our society, women in particular, who have not been very involved, a more active citizenship?
Look, first of all, I don't think at a time of unique, unprecedented national crisis, young women, people just coming to understand the place of women's society, should take anything from the fact that women were not the major spokespeople for this crisis. First of all, I remind them of Condoleezza Rice, in case they missed her. Who?
Karen Hughes.
Yes, but
Condoleezza Rice was recently interviewed on 60 Minutes. She wasn't too visible in the early days of all of this.
Oh, I think she was. She's been extraordinarily visible. She is the person on whom the president most depends.
Oh,
the
yes,
National Security Advisor
we're
is
aware
just
of.
that. You can't run over to the State Department every day. The person who briefs you, tells you what she thinks you should say, is literally the National Security Advisor. So I ask people not to blink that. But I ask them also to remember this. This could easily have happened when Bill Clinton was president.
Sure.
Who then would be a major national spokesperson? The female Secretary of State. All of this, Madeleine Albright. So all this tells us is that is something that we have just discussed at the level of national or international leadership. Women have not yet risen. That doesn't mean that the pipeline isn't chock full of women. I mean, it's bursting over with women. But to rise through that pipeline probably takes more than a generation. The first generation was spent just preparing women, making sure they went to college, making sure that making sure that they entered the fields that led to the pipeline in the first place, opening the doors. So I'm not concerned that at the national leadership you don't see women. It ought to propel us to understand that we got to move faster to get more women in Congress, to get more women in those positions, to remind us that there are women out there quite capable of doing what the men are doing if we make sure that they are where they ought to be.
And when we started all of this, Madeleine Albright, we couldn't imagine a Secretary of State or a National Security Advisor.
Unspeakable.
And we've got you in the Congress.
That wasn't so unspeakable, but yes, you're right. Here we had a woman who was Attorney General of the United States. But there are very few posts like that. Leadership is a pyramid. And it is very important that women understand that the work of leadership is being done all up and down that pyramid and not just at the top level. You don't have to be president of the United States to have influence in American society. And he will tell you that sometimes he thinks that people way down in the pyramid have a whole lot more influence than he does.
And I think that's really the note of encouragement for our students that we're going to bring back. You're an inspiration. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.